When you're sourcing from China, there's some very important things you need to consider when you're creating your purchase order or your purchase contract. And if you don't get these things exactly right, it's going to be difficult to enforce the agreement that you have in any kind of Chinese court of law or Chinese system. So I've invited my friend Steve Simonson, who's been doing this for decades. He's imported thousands of containers from China. He's got a team on the ground in China. He really knows his stuff. And so he's going to be giving you some really good pointers on what you need to include and what you need to look for when creating your purchase order contracts and in dealing with Chinese manufacturers. So Steve, welcome. Super happy to have you here, man.
Hello everybody, my name is Steve Simonson, and today we're going to talk a little bit about Sourcing 101. And the great thing about the Freedom Ticket is you get to learn all of these great skills and all these wonderful techniques to be able to put your product online and list it on Amazon and be successful. But my job today is to tell you, how do we take it from the product discovery stage and move it into the sourcing stage? And I'm going to give you a few tips and hints along the way. Now, the good news for you is you get to see two of me right at this moment. I will give you a little introduction about myself. I'm an old entrepreneur, right? I've been doing this 30 plus years, and I've started online in the late 90s. Having websites and various sales channels, even in the late 90s. And that was after starting my businesses in the late 80s. I've always maintained a multi-channel approach to business, which has included Amazon. But I also look at other channels as well, because we want to be, for my own company, my own strategy, we want to be kind of a larger enterprise and look at lots of different sales channels. Now, just as a point of reference, I've been traveling to China since around 2001 and been buying in container volumes since then, and not insignificant volumes. We've probably purchased, well over $300 million from China and foreign countries over the course of my career. And like the old McDonald's saying, over 1 billion served. My team and my companies have accrued over $1 billion in sales in my career as well. So that doesn't mean I got $1 billion in the back room here. It just means that we've been able to put some points on the board. And all of this is just to give you context to decide if, when Steve says, here's some ideas on how to do sourcing, if you should listen or not. And maybe here's a good reason why you shouldn't. My first axiom, axiom number 0, the most important one, is I don't know nothing about nothing. And I go into this general mindset, and I encourage you guys to come into this course and really into the Freedom Ticket with that same mindset. I don't know nothing about nothing, right? I'm here to learn. And today I'm asking you to set your own biases aside, maybe even some of your own experience, and just open yourself up to some of my ideas and some of my techniques, because I think what you'll find is these are tried and true. Again, over the course of time, we've put some points on the board. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about what we call Product Sourcing 101. Now, you guys have already, had the opportunity to learn a lot about Helium-10. And the product discovery process, where you're taking ideas and you're going through the discovery process, you can use Helium-10 to work on that. But at the point where you say, gosh, I need to take that idea and I need to turn it into sourcing, this is where I come in, and that's why you're here. And so we run what we call a sourcing process, right? So you see the top bar there, it says product sourcing, and then we list all the sub-steps that we have to get done to make that product sourcing process work, right? Technically, everything in business is a process, right? Your product discovery was a process. Now we're going to do product sourcing. And at the time that we're completed with product sourcing, assuming we come out with a win, then we go into the item launch process or something similar to that, right? So think of your business as just handoff points between each part of the kind of overall tactics, right? So, first you have an idea, then you do product discovery, then you do sourcing, then you do sample evaluation, and then you launch the product. So we're not going to go through every little bit of text that's on this slide, because we're going to dive into it a little deeper as we carry on. The number one thing I want you guys to do is I want you to think systemically. So before we dive into kind of the line item details on that sourcing process, I want you to open yourselves up to think systemically. right? And so when we run a sourcing project, we literally run it as a project, right? There's a Gantt chart on your left, and it shows this thing's going to take some time. It starts at, sometime in September and goes through, sometime in October. That's because that's how long things take. I know that people are like, oh, I can do this in an hour, or I can do this in 2 days, or I just sent an email on Alibaba and everything was done. And there are examples of those kind of wins that happen. But in general, a process takes time, and a thorough process especially takes more time. And I would just tell you that this is one of those areas that you don't want to make mistakes, and you don't want to scrimp or save. And you certainly don't want to rush it just to meet some deadline that's arbitrary, like Chinese New Year or Q4. Do it systemically. Think about the big picture. Don't think about 3 months from now. Think about 3 years from now. And that's why I want you to just slow down to speed up. Ultimately, your business will grow faster if you maintain these tried and true techniques. All right, so we're back into that process, right? So the first part of the sourcing is we need to come up with a list of prospective factories, right? And how do you do that? Well, maybe there's some obvious choices that you can cull out by looking at sites like ImportYeti.com or other sites that show you where some of your competition buys. And if you're not familiar with that, you can just, on your own time, go to ImportYeti.com, look up the brand name of one of your competitors, and maybe you'll be able to see his company and you'll be able to see his factories. And I won't get into too much of that detail right now, but your competition's factories would be potentially obvious choices. Now, creative choices could be some alternative that is like, well, I found the factory, whether it's in China or Vietnam or USA, and they have a competitor, their main competitor. You've sussed out this factory's main competitor. That's who you want to go with, because then at least you can be more important to them. One downside of using your competitor's factory is they may be more important to that factory, and you may not get some of the things that you want. So you have to really think about these different kind of relationships and how you would interact with them. Now, of course, another idea is that you may have already existing suppliers. Maybe they can help you extend your product line, and this would be worthy of consideration. And then, of course, whether it's Alibaba or 1688 or any number of the other factory kind of inquiries that you can make online, you have to start making that list of factories. Now, once you start to figure out who's preliminarily qualified, so when you're first reaching out to factories, maybe it's not necessary to keep close track, right? Because maybe they say, well, we don't make what you want. So there's no point in keeping track of that factory for the long term. But once you get into the preliminary qualifications, you want to start scoring these factories based on things like I've listed here on the screen. Responsiveness, right? If they are hard to get before the order, they're going to be impossible to get after the order, right? When it comes up to your consideration of those qualifications, and you look at the obvious one, which is, do they match what the specifications are that you wanted, right? Or do they have to tell you, well, we can't do it like that, we've got to do it like this? The more they are off your spec, the less they are qualified. And then, of course, the communications. How clear are they? Is it something that you feel like you're having to meet them more than halfway on communications? That is a surefire sign of future trouble. And that doesn't mean it's perfect, by the way. Let's not kid ourselves that, somebody speaking a second language, first of all, let's have respect for that. They speak more than one language. But that doesn't mean they're fluent in the same way that, you would speak. And I guarantee you, I highly recommend that you avoid colloquial terms or slang or things like that, because they just won't understand what it is, because that's not what's taught in the schools and universities and so forth, where they learn their language for English skills, for example. So stay away from all that slang and all the colloquial terms that you might use, and just speak clearly and in small sentences. I've seen sellers, going over to China. In that context, they're the buyer; they're buying from the factory. But this Amazon seller would just start with a whole, almost like a paragraph of demands, and that is not going to get you a good answer. You need to be, point one, and then ask the question and get a response. Point two, ask the question, get a response. You can't just do it in big bulky batches because that's not good communication. And then ultimately, you should follow your gut if this factory is getting what you're asking them to do, if you think they're being honest and so forth. And that, that only goes so far, but your gut is a good indicator that if you think this is terrible right out of the gates, then it probably is. And of course, now we're validating. Once you preliminary qualified a bunch of factories, now you validate to make sure that the item, the candidate item as we call it, or the this new concept that you're trying to come up with, is that even economically viable, right? And so we call it a reality check. What's the price you're going to be able to sell it at? What's the margin? Did you do enough RFQs, which means requests for quote? Did you do enough of those to really understand the market pricing? I do think it's a mistake for people to just get one quote or two quotes. I think you don't understand the market if you're not getting multiple quotes. And I'll be honest with you, we often will get 5 to 10 quotes because we want to understand the market and what's driving some of the differences in price. And some will be high and some will be low, but that doesn't automatically mean one is better than the other. You need to understand what's baked into that equation. The other thing you can do is challenge the minimum order quantity, also known as the MOQ, and just say, gosh, this is a new product line. It's essentially a test, and we need your help, factory, to support us during this test. If it goes great, we're going to order lots and lots of it, but we can't start out with the version 1.0 of this product being, perfect. And that means we need to have a lower MOQ so we can place secondary orders with improvements and also mitigate our risk. The other thing you want to talk about with your factory is what's driving the MOQ. Maybe they're really specific about the MOQ, but you realize if you just move the product dimensions in by a half an inch or something relatively insignificant, then it could completely change the packaging or it could completely change the material yields. And those yields are what drive your price and what often drive your MOQ. So sometimes packaging is an MOQ driver, and you could just go, you know what? I know you're saying you need 5,000 packages. I only want 1,000 units. I'm going to go ahead and pay for the 5,000 packages. Keep them at your factory. We'll just ship the first 1,000. And by the way, those packages might be anywhere from 10 cents to $1. At least you're mitigating the cost of the product for those 4,000 extra units by just saying hold the packaging there, and your worst case is you never use the packaging and you have sunk cost of that packaging. But that's a heck of a lot better than ordering a $30 item times 4,000 unit or 4,000 extra units just to hit some MOQ that's driven by packaging. You see how the relationship between packaging and MOQ was falsely driving the MOQ narrative. This happens an awful lot, and sometimes it happens again, as I said before, with the yield of the product. So if they say, well, we can't do it because of the dimensions or this or that, then start thinking about how to change those dimensions and be clear about it. The other thing you need to really do as part of checking your economic viability is checking the HS code, sometimes called HTS or HTC, but you need to know what the tariffs, duties, anti-dumping, any of those types of things that might be related to that product are, because you do not want a surprise. Okay, so now that you've got kind of the basics from the supply chain or the factory, now you need to start making your product outline, right? This is where you start to write what the product brief looks like, and now you're outlining the specifications, and you're thinking about how am I going to make things not just different but better, right? Too often people are like, oh, well, everybody else is a circle, I'm going to make mine an octagon. That's not necessarily a key enough difference to be successful if your octagon is poor quality, right? Now, maybe it is in terms of a visual differentiation, that gets the attention, but if the quality sucks, you have not accomplished anything. Focus on quality, and don't forget, as I mentioned in the notes, health and safety. And what you're doing is you're gathering data, and we put this in our database, and you're building towards a master SKU database. That's your objective. So now you have a product outline, and this is now what you really go to the factories with to try to nail down who is going to be the winner, right? And you're going from the prospects to the qualified factories And then fundamentally, then you're moving to the factories that are actually in use, that you're doing production with. That's how you move through the factory choices. And then, as I always say, start easy. Don't try to, thread some crazy needle that you think you need to get everything perfect. It's just not usually possible. And then we are a big believer in supplier communications, and we like to keep all those communications, because many times if there's some sort of problem or question that comes later, those communications are the key difference to who's right and who's wrong. And by the way, we don't mind if we're the wrong ones, right? Maybe we said, oh, well, gosh, we said we wanted 1,000 of those. You shipped us 10,000, but our PO said 10,000. That's on us, right? So communications and being clear about who says what is pretty useful. The decision bias should always be about risk mitigation. So your bias for making a decision should be, if I do this, is this, am I betting the whole farm? Am I making a choice that I can't recover from? And you want to avoid those kinds of risks, which means lower MOQs, easier start with the factory, and asking them for cooperation and help. So every one of our suppliers, we put it into a database. So it doesn't matter if we choose them ultimately or not. We want to make sure that we don't forget the communication. And we actually will send the communication from our database, and we will kind of request quotes from there. We'll get the purchase orders placed from here. We do all of this because we want to make sure that nothing is lost to bad memories. And I will tell you that email, if you think that's a good system, you're wrong. Yeah, I'm sorry to tell you. But email is fine for some things, but in general, it's very difficult to parse and search and look for those emails, and they don't create a good enough system for usage long term. And remember, when you buy hundreds of millions of dollars worth of stuff, you kind of know what works and what doesn't. So you have to take my word for it on this one, everybody. So supplier due diligence is the next bit, right? What are we going to do to make sure that they're qualified? How are we checking our existing suppliers to make sure they maintain compliance? And then, of course, as always, we document everything, as I just talked about, and you reward cooperation. Take them out to dinner. Tell them you give them an extra 50 cents a unit if they hit these metrics. That will make a huge difference to them, and it doesn't make a massive difference to you if you reward cooperation on getting things past inspections or hitting certain quality standards, etc., etc. Okay, now that we've got the supplier in the database, now we can do some analysis, right? And we need to make sure that all suppliers follow this standardized kind of protocol for submitting information, right? You want to make sure that you have some sort of input form that have the same fields for every supplier. And this is just to get a clear vision from your database. You want to make sure that you either fill it out, or you can have your sourcing company fill it out, or the vendor can fill it out. But somebody's got to fill this thing out. At least this is how the best people do it. And you ask them, what other things are they supplying? Who else are they supplying? What kind of pricing? And then ultimately, you're going to take that information across the final supplier candidates, and you're going to make a decision. Are they a no-go, which means they didn't make this cut, but you still want to, save that supplier information, right? You don't want to lose that, because now that's equity. You know something about the supplier. Maybe you can use them in the future, even if they weren't the right fit on this particular project. The next thing is, hey, we did find somebody we want to go, and so we're going to now move on to the sample process, right? This is pretty simple. And this is kind of a quick example of what a sourcing checklist looks like. What's your development SKU number? What are the descriptions? And you just kind of move right on down the line, packaging, color, price per unit at these quantities. It's somewhat exhaustive. Suppliers don't love to do this if they don't think they're going to get the business, but you have to just ask them politely to cooperate with you, and that's the best chance they have of earning that business. Okay, so I prefer to send POs for anything, including samples. So create a PO for the samples, and be sure you talk about anything that's important in there. The product brief we talked about earlier, any specifications you've outlined, and then any key differentiators, right, that may be important to put on that sample. And then finally, make sure that they're complying with health and safety that you may already know about that product. Once you make the PO, now you're tracking the samples. If you're getting samples from a number of factories, which is often the case, you might consider using a sample consolidator, and they will just get all the samples together and make one shipment to you. And I know that people talk about, oh gosh, I don't want to have to pay for samples. This is no fun. But if you knew how many sample tire kickers that factories get, you would understand why they have to charge for samples. It's a small amount of money. It certainly doesn't make their business profitable, but it's just a preventative kind of measure to make sure that people aren't just constantly ordering samples from them with no business coming down the line. So I do think it's reasonable for factories to have some cost, especially when you don't know them. Long term, we have people sending us pallets of samples that cost them, thousands of dollars to ship it to us, and not to mention the value of the goods. And they do that because we already have an established relationship. So it doesn't always have to be paid, but early on, it's most likely going to be paid. And then, of course, once you get the samples, you're going to evaluate them, right? You're going to look at any photos and videos. You're going to make any comments, go back and forth with the factory about questions, and then perhaps you're even doing some questions. And now, let's just say you got factory samples from 3 factories. Now you're back to a decision point again, and you have to say, who am I going with, right? Did any of these make the cut? And if they didn't, then we move back to the process, and if they did, we move forward. Your mission is to run a sourcing system that produces a predictable result every time. That's what a system is. Okay, so now once you've selected the winner, now you go ahead and you say, well, here's the master sample, and I like to get 3 master samples. So once you get the master samples, you keep 1 with yourself or at the company HQ. You give 1 to your inspection company, and you let the factory keep 1. Those are 3 samples, and you or somebody in your company should initial all 3 of those, and then they should go to their appropriate parties. The reason why this is important is because if there's any disputes later, these are the master samples that determine whether those disputes are going to be in your favor or in their favor. I really can't stress enough to manage your master samples, and do not keep them in open sunlight because it changes the color over time and for a lot of products. Put them in some sort of storage and insist that the others, the factory and the inspection company, do the same. Drawers or some sort of box or something, keep it kind of preserved for comparison to future shipments. Now, by the way, you're going to take all of that preliminary data on your development product and you're going to make an item out of it, right? You need to assign a barcode. How long is this product good on its shelf life? How long do you expect this product to last? What are the weights, units of measure for the weights? All of these various things are really, really important. And again, we like to do this in a database. And I certainly would encourage you guys to do the same, because when you start to have multiple items, especially, every little detail kind of flitters away, right? You start to forget stuff. And when you have a team, whether it's VAs or whatever, if everybody can access the same data, boy, you are far, far better off, way ahead of the game. And then finally, now that you've made an item, now you're going to move to the product introduction process, right? So we've actually now gone all the way through from product discovery, when the handoff originally happened. We went through the sourcing process, which went into the sample process, and then ultimately ended with the product decision process. And if that's a favorable outcome, then it kicks over to the product introduction process, right? See how it's all just a flow. Everything is just very systemic and very easy to consider. Now, I want to talk about a little bonus stuff here. So here's some myths about China. Number 1 myth, payment terms from factories are impossible. That's not true. Now, it's not unreasonable to start out like that, especially if it's a new factory and especially if your volumes are low. But when you start getting into container size orders and kind of regular frequency of orders, then the factory will have enough of a relationship with you. You'll also have established some credit with a government company called Sinosure in China. I won't go into the details, but let's just say they know what you're exporting, and if they see you doing enough volume over the consistent amount of time, you're building something that allows you to get credit with factories, that the government gets a backstop, or the government provides a backstop to the factories using something called credit insurance. Another thing people think is contracts aren't enforceable in China. That's absolutely not true, but it's really, really critical in how the contract is made. And a lot of people think that factory direct is the only way to buy, right? They're like, oh, this is a trading company. No way I can use them. And I would just tell you that these are all wrong, right? You shouldn't consider these as facts. There may be some generalities that there's some truth to these, but on the day-to-day type of business, I want you guys to know that all of this is overcomable. You can get terms, you can enforce contracts, and trading companies can often be a great way to launch your product. And then again, once you grow to a certain level, maybe you should get to factory direct. But there are many trading companies who will give you lower price than the factories that you know of for a lot of different reasons. Okay, I just want to give you an example of what a proper Chinese PO looks like. The first thing is, if you don't have the information on the PO in Chinese, meaning the exact right name of the factory, the exact address of the factory, everything has to be very precise. If any of those are wrong, you're going to lose, right? That's just the way it is. And so this is kind of stacked against you a little bit. But if you grow to a level that this is worthwhile to you, and you have a sourcing agent or some help in China to fill out this stuff in both English and Chinese, then you'll be able to have an enforceable PO. And I think we're even going to include an example of this for you. So I know I've just taken you through a really comprehensive process, but I'm going to give you a couple tips. One is listen to the process. The process works. Thinking systemically always works. And even though you may be getting started now and this seems a little bit overwhelming, I want you to know all you have to do is just rewind the video, look at the process. Just think about what you need to do between each and every step. And finally, a book that I highly recommend, I'm not affiliated in any way, but the author is a brilliant guy. The book is called Poorly Made in China. Anybody who buys from China really should understand that book. It doesn't mean you shouldn't buy from China. I buy lots of stuff from China and other countries. But it does mean that understanding how that culture works and understanding how you can raise your skills to become as good of a trader as those factories, right? The factories, all they do every day is make deals. And if this is your first one, you need to bring your skills up. And this book can really help you get there. And it just makes you better informed, better prepared. So listen, I really salute you guys for taking this Freedom Ticket training. You are in the right place at the right time. I absolutely love the online business, and I think there's no better place for you to find the best ROI with the lowest risk than where you are right now. So good luck on your journey. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time, everybody. Bye-bye.